My name is Chris Stosky. My background is in religious studies and sociology. Specifically, I do research on religious experiences and spiritual disciplines, as well as understanding sense of consciousness and awareness relative to the presence of the divine. So in connection with that, I was very grateful to have the opportunity to be able to moderate this evening's discussion, because it's not often we get to hear not only from someone with a background in continental philosophy, but also who brings a background in Japanese philosophy. So to think of those influences about the nature of experience and consciousness and awakening to realism that she's going to share with us this evening, I'm very privileged to be able to do that. Yuko's a recent PhD, or about to receive her PhD in a couple weeks from the University of Copenhagen, and look forward to the evening.
Great, thank you, Chris. So I might stand up today. First of all, thank you, Pete. Thank you, YHouse. Thank you, Rubin Museum, for hosting me. I'm really privileged to be able to talk today in front of all of you. So today, I want to share some insights from Japanese philosophy, specifically from a Japanese philosopher called Nishida Kitaro. He was born in 1870, died in 1945. And he is the most influential Japanese philosopher till this day. He's known for establishing what is called the Kyoto school tradition. And today, since it's not an academic talk, I'm not going to bore you with all the specifics about what Nishida did or did not say, what scholars have, the way they have interpreted Nishida. Rather, I want to focus on the actual matter, what's really interesting about his philosophy. But I want to start by introducing a very simple haiku by a Japanese poet from the 17th century, Basho, Matsuo Basho. I'll first read it in Japanese, and then I'll translate it. Yoku mireba, nazuna hanasaku kakine kana. Yoku mireba, nazuna hanasaku kakine kana. So if I can translate it, looking closely, a nazuna, which is a small flower, a nazuna blooms by the hedge. Looking closely, a nazuna blooms by the hedge. Let us try to imagine how Basho came up with this haiku, the background to how he came up with this haiku. We can imagine that he was sitting in his room by the window, and he's trying really hard to think of a good haiku. So he looks out his window, he's looking for some kind of inspiration, and he sees this small flower blooming by his fence. And he thinks, oh, this would be a good haiku. So looking closely here means observing carefully, looking more carefully. I see the flower blooming. But we can think of another alternative kind of situation. You can again imagine that he's sitting in his room, looking at the window. He's also kind of stressed that he has the pressure to produce new good haiku, and he's really thinking hard. But then, rather thoughtlessly, this flower catches his attention. And in that moment of seeing the flower, there's no thought, oh, this is going to be a good haiku or anything like that. In that very moment of seeing the flower, there's simply the reality of the flower realizing itself. So looking closely here doesn't mean observing carefully, looking more. Rather, it means seeing reality in a different light. Not in light of our practical concerns, where things only have meaning if they make sense within this meaningful context, but rather in light of reality itself. I wanted to introduce this haiku because I think it nicely captures the fact that reality has depth. We can see we can see reality, we can become aware of reality in different ways, on different levels. And most of the time in our practical lives, we see reality through our lens, through our different lenses. But fundamentally, reality just shows itself from itself. So reality has depth, and so does our awareness of it. Okay, so this was a prelude to my talk. Now I want to focus on my talk today, which I want to focus on Nishida's concept of jikaku, which is usually translated as self-awareness. And in connection to that, I will talk a bit about basho, which has nothing to do with the poet basho, but basho in Japanese means place. So I'll talk about self-awareness, jikaku, and in connection I'll talk about basho, place, and then at the end I'll talk about zettai muno jikaku, self-awareness of absolute nothingness. Okay, let's begin with jikaku. Jikaku is a Japanese word that is used in everyday speech. We use it all the time. It's comprised of two Chinese characters, ji and kaku. Ji means self, kaku means awakening or realization. So together it means self-awakening, self-realization. So as the term suggests, it's originally a Buddhist term. When it's used in ordinary speech, though, today, this religious connotation is lost, but it still carries the sense of coming to a realization or raising one's awareness about something. So for example, if a politician is exposed of his engagement in some corrupt practice, then the media bashes him for lack of jikaku as a government official. Or if one is about to become a parent, then he or she would say to herself or himself, I must now take up jikaku as a mother or a father, meaning that I must now adapt to my new way of being, to the new social roles and norms that surrounds becoming a parent. So raising one's awareness here doesn't just mean becoming aware of something. It means becoming aware of something in the sense of appropriating it in your manner of being, in your way of being. So here we can distinguish between understanding something, so take the example of the jikaku as a mother, to understanding what is involved in being a mother, understanding what motherhood involves, which is a kind of detached, theoretical kind of understanding. We can distinguish that from the understanding that is involved in jikaku. This kind of understanding is a practical, engaged kind of self-understanding, where the understanding of, it's an understanding of yourself as a mother. So jikaku as a mother is to become aware of what is involved in being a mother, and also to act accordingly as a mother. Now, in order to have this kind of jikaku, this kind of self-awareness, one must be open to one's social context in such a way that understanding what it means to be a mother reflects back on your self-understanding as a mother. So jikaku implies that the self is open to one's situated place. One cannot be self-enclosed, self-encapsulated, or isolated from the rest of society to have this kind of self-awareness. When we usually think of self-awareness, we think, well, we're just aware of ourselves. We think of this in isolation from others, but jikaku in this Japanese sense, the sense that Nishida is talking about, presupposes that the self is fundamentally open to one's surrounding, to others, to the social context. And this is how jikaku presupposes the idea of place. So to be self-aware is literally to find one's place. And I think this English phrase is very convenient, as it nicely captures that becoming aware of one's social role is literally to find your situated place. So in our everyday lives, we are aware of ourselves in various ways. We find our place in different places. We play various roles. So I'm not a mother yet, so I don't have jikaku as a mother, but I'm a PhD student in philosophy. So I have jikaku as a PhD student in philosophy, which means that I'm open to the academic community. I'm open to the philosophical community, to the university, and I act accordingly. So I do conference presentations, I submitted a thesis I have to defend in a couple of weeks. I'm also a Nishida scholar working outside of Japan, writing in English, talking in English, and having the jikaku as a person doing that. I'm aware of my role as a person between the East and West, if I can put it that way, of disseminating knowledge about Japanese philosophy, about Nishida, and making it accessible to a wider public. I'm also aware of myself as a woman working in philosophy. I'm aware because in philosophy there are not that many women, so I'm aware of a lot of gender inequality issues, which means that not only am I just theoretically aware of this, I'm practically engaged in this. I try to do something about it. So in our daily lives, we are aware of ourselves in various ways, which means that we are open to our surroundings, to various worlds. We can call it a world. We live in various worlds, which is a meaningful context. But the meaningful contextual whole, this world, they're colored by the way we project meaning. So if I were to start losing interest in the academic community, then the things that used to matter for me, like presenting at conferences, publishing a lot, and so on and so forth, I start caring less about it. So the world that we find ourselves in is not as stable and secure as we think it is, because it ultimately depends on us to give it meaning. The world depends on us as the provider of meaning. This brings us to wonder whether we can actually step outside of these world of this meaning. Rather than being aware of ourselves as a mother, as a PhD student, as something, as a woman, and so on and so forth, can we become aware of ourselves as none of that, as absolutely nothing? Can we have jikaku of absolute nothingness? This might be a scary thought for many people. You might think, well, how can we find our place without the meaningful world that we live in? Well, let me give you an example. Imagine one night, you're a bit tired, you've been working all week, you need some air, so you go for a walk, you go take a walk. And you're taking a walk in your familiar neighborhood, you're just walking. Then you look up, rather thoughtlessly. You look up, and this beautiful moon catches your attention. And you're mesmerized by this experience of the moon. In that very moment of seeing the moon, Am I there? In that very experience, you forget that you're there. You forget that you're looking at the moon. You forget all your worries. You're absolutely nothing but the realizing reality. You're absolutely nothing but the moon actualizing itself through you. So this kind of jikaku is very different from the jikaku of jikaku as something, jikaku as a mother, jikaku as a father, as a PhD student. Jikaku as absolute nothingness is none of this. It's the pure openness. Jikaku as absolute nothingness is the pure openness where reality can simply unfold. So we can take up different roles and we can live in various worlds. We can find meaning in the various worlds and our practical activities that we engage in. But the very place that we can be home at, secure and sound, is a place of absolute nothingness, where you don't identify yourself as any of these practical activities, but it's this place of absolute nothingness, if you just open your eyes to, is just there. So I want to call this awakened realism, because we awaken to the reality itself in this kind of understanding of reality. It's very different from naive realism, which is a position where you think that reality exists independently of you. You think that objects, the world, exists independently of you. This kind of understanding is based on a basic subject-object framework. And it's a very useful framework because all the meaningful contextual whole, all the various worlds can build on this framework. But I think what Nishida's philosophy does is that it elucidates, illuminates this reality that is prior to the subject-object split. And it shows that you can awaken to this reality that fundamentally lies in the deeper layer of our awareness. So quickly, tying it back to the haiku, I think that Basho's haiku also nicely captures how we can awaken to this reality. Looking closely, the flower blooms by the hedge. Here we come to see reality in a different light, in light of reality itself. And here we awaken to reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuko. I think for me, having the opportunity to hear your talk and reflect, especially from a Japanese philosophical tradition that's intentionally trying to think through Western ideas, as well as ideas that come out of the Japanese tradition. And I think one of the things that's intriguing to me, and I think part of my first question to you, has to do with this notion of looking closely or self-awareness. As, thinking through this museum, the influences of the Tibetan traditions, and thinking about certain types of disciplines like meditation, or even within the Zen tradition, like koans, which has been very influential in Japan. In terms of cultivating looking closely, self-awareness, are there disciplines, right? Because I was intrigued when you said that I was trying to distinguish in certain ways this from kind of Buddhist conceptions. So, but is it reading haiku? Is it writing haiku? Are there disciplines and practices that one can help to develop and cultivate the sense of self-awareness?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really important question, how to cultivate looking reality in a different light. How do we go out of this normal way of looking at reality through our colored lenses? Most of the times we're just bothered by our practical concerns. So how do we get out of this? But I think if we think of this notion of jikaku and what it really means, that it depends on, it presupposes that the self is not self-enclosed, but open to your surroundings. So even in the ordinary sense of being self-aware, you have to be open. Oftentimes we're not aware of this. We don't think that in order to have self-awareness, you have to be open to your community or to your surroundings or your environment. We often don't think in that way, but really what is happening is that when you cultivate your jikaku as a mother, when you're about to become a mother, what you're doing is stepping outside of yourself and becoming open to this new community that you now must partake in, right? Parenthood. What does it mean to be a family? This kind of stuff. So I think even at this level of when we normally think of our self-awareness, it's about being open to your surroundings. And also, I don't think it's too different, cultivating this sense of seeing reality in a different light, becoming aware of absolute nothingness. It's not that much different. It's this idea of being open, letting yourself be open. And for example, meditation is a way to nurture that sense of being open. Not identifying yourself with any specific role, but being open to what comes.
Thank you. I mean, I think that leads very nicely, I think, to the next question that I would have is this sense of feeling at home. If oftentimes people think of absolute nothingness and being at home, it's not concepts that would normally go together. So, you know, how do you feel at home? How do you develop a situated place when in the grand scheme of things, you're relating to an absolute nothingness? How do you bring those two concepts together?
It's true that, I mean, taking the example of the jikaku as a mother, your family is home, right? You feel at home being with your family. So, I mean, in our usual way of thinking, we don't really think that there's nothing outside of this home, this meaningful context that we find ourselves in. But the truth is that it's quite fragile, this world that we live in, because it could at any time collapse. You're not guaranteed that you'll forever have a family life. You're not guaranteed that you'll forever be able to live in this community. So the meaningful contextual whole, the world that we live in, is not that secure. And sometimes there are moments in our lives when we have to face that. And I think if we, in our daily lives, try to be more open, nurture this sense that there is a deeper layer of reality beyond the realm of meaning that we project, then you do actually feel at home. You can nurture this sense of feeling at home, not in any particular place as such, but in this deeper layer of reality that we can become aware of.
So I think this also leads nicely to the next point, which is the example of motherhood. And although I'm not a mother, I am a father. And thinking very carefully about, you know, the kind of sense of place that generates in me, but also the kind of ethic of care, the nervousness and the worry that goes along with being a parent and trying to raise children. I think bringing up the example of motherhood kind of strikingly brings this into a practical sensibility rather than just an abstract one. But it also kind of brings to bear the notion of an ethic of care. And I think your notion of kind of the fragility of our notion of reality is important, but how do you bring together kind of the kind of absolute sense of care that one feels for raising, nurturing a child with this sense of absolute nothingness? How do you square or gain perspective, I guess is maybe the right word, to basically be able to be in your situated place as a parent, as a mother, as a father, but also have this perspective of absolute nothingness? That must be incredibly difficult. So how does one go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So what's the distinction, if I can rephrase it, what's the distinction, what's the difference between a mother who has jikaku as a mother, who's aware of herself as a mother, but is not aware of this deeper level of reality, and a mother who is aware of this deeper layer of reality, that she's fundamentally absolute nothing? I think that one of the dangers of self-awareness is that it can turn into a kind of self-entanglement, right? So this, you start off being open to your community, to what motherhood consists of, in order to know what is involved in being a mother. But then there's a danger that you start identifying your role, your self-identity as a mother. When you do that, it's a danger, because ultimately this family life can collapse, right? It's not so secure. So I think a person who has understood this, that fundamentally you're absolutely nothing, this person can have a different attitude to being a mother, or to taking up different roles in the society, because you can take a different attitude to it. You can become more playful, because basically what you're doing in your daily life is playing different roles, right? You're an actor on stage. And once you come to realize that, life becomes much more playful. You don't identify yourself as this or that. You know that you're fundamentally none of that. And then life becomes much more fun, I think. And it doesn't mean that the mother cannot care for the child in the same way. She actually can do a much better job of taking care of her child if she has this understanding.
That's a wonderful perspective. I think something that's, I think for me, for having familiarity with the Buddhist tradition, I can grasp and grapple with, but still it's difficult to put into practice. And so in thinking about that difficulty, I'm also thinking about kind of absolute nothingness versus an absolute somethingness. Oftentimes the ground of reality is often posited in any number of traditions in terms of a something, whether it be a divine, a God, certain types of spiritual reality that one would posit as a something. So why an absolute nothingness? Why not an absolute something? What's the if I'm thinking very cost benefit about this, why believe in absolute nothingness? Why hold that as the ground of reality? What does that gain you?
There's a danger in saying that the ground of reality, or the fundamental layer of reality, is absolute nothingness. There is a danger to saying that, because once you do that, you make it as if it is something, right? That's the danger of language. It's as if there is something like absolute nothingness that you must attain. But I think the most important point is that when Nishida talks about absolute nothingness, it's not outside of yourself, right? Nishida is trying to go beyond the subject-object scheme, the subject-object duality that we normally think in terms of. So absolute nothingness is the deeper layer of reality that we become aware of through our self-realization, self-awakening. So it's beyond the subject-object split. So Nishida actually also speaks of absolute nothingness as the absolute being, right? So it could be both, actually,
Really?
whatever you name it. Of course, he does sometimes speak of God, but it cannot be a God in the sense that it's an object or a subject. It's beyond this duality itself. But I understand it's a very difficult kind of concept to grapple with. But it's not really a concept, that's the point.
Beyond conceptual thinking and kind of getting out of the trap of the way in which we think and posit. And so I think with that, I'd like to open it up to the audience with questions. So.
You can find on the internet, if you look up Nishida Kitaro or Kyoto School, you'll find the Stanford Encyclopedia article. And it's slightly technical, but at the same time, if you skim through it, you can get the general idea. And I think it's a great introduction. You can start there. Exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi. As a musician, I've experienced, especially when writing, sometimes when playing, the experience of I've experienced sort of the dissolution of myself. I've disappeared to a certain degree, and time is just, I can't measure it. I don't know where it goes. I know that I'm doing something. The word I doesn't refer to me at that time. I have meditated when I was in college and went through a very, very terrifying experience where I was in that state for somewhere between 1.5 to 2 years. I think this relates to what you're saying, for one thing, and it's not something that I intellectualized. It happened to me, and then I tried to figure it out. I just wanted to mention this, and I want to tell you that during these states, there was something that was very distant in terms of experiencing emotions. And I wonder if, when you're talking about this nothingness, which I do believe I understand what you're saying, do you find that you and emotions do not seem to combine to a certain degree? Would you ever experience extreme sorrow, extreme fear, or extreme joy in those states, but especially the more negative ones the things we call negative?
I think fear, anxiety, these kind of negative feelings arise when you're kind of in between. When you're in between this meaningful contextual whole, the worlds that you normally live in, and you kind of also see that there's something beyond that. So you're starting to realize that you're absolutely nothing, that really the self does not exist. But there's something very scary about that, I think. But I think that is part of the journey. But that's also something that ultimately, I think the fear is something that comes from the ego. It's something that you're clinging on to, right? Once you're able to let that go, though, and purely just see reality as it is, I think in the Buddhist traditions and also the way Nishida talks about it, it's not really negative at all. It's very blissful. It's talked about in terms of joy. But also, I think what's important is that this turning point, right, where you go from this fear of letting go of your world to this blissful stage of absolute nothingness, doesn't really come from inside. There's not, you can only do so much to try and to go to that level. It's something that happens to you. Like with the examples I gave with the haiku, it's like the nature just kind of, awakens you. You can only do so much. You can meditate, you can cultivate it, but ultimately it comes from not really the outside, because it's not really, there's no outer inner, but it comes to you at some point, I think.
What would you say the relationship is between jikaku and mushin?
Jikaku and?
Mushin.
Mushin? So mushin is no mind. We can translate it as no mind. Mu is nothing and shin is mind. Well, I think machine resonates well with this level of absolute nothingness. The letting go of your mind is part and parcel with becoming aware that you're not this thing that you think you are. But I'll have to think about that a bit more. Thank you.
I'm interested in the origin of self-awareness. So there is a test, the mirror test. So there are certain animals that happen to be all social animals that pass the mirror test. Dolphins, magpies, elephants, the great apes, and of course some humans, or most humans. And I would think that this maybe should be the beginning of understanding, following your idea of going to the family, but even going beyond the family. The rest of our social reality is part of developing self-awareness, is it not? And then not only observing, but participating in changing social reality.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's realizing that part of jikaku, or becoming aware of yourself, is really to let yourself be open to your community, to your society. And that means partaking in it, understanding yourself as a member of the society. So there's a lot of norms attached to it. And you become, part of self-awareness is becoming aware of your social norms. So it's a very kind of, self-awareness is not theoretical. It's a kind of practically engaged kind of understanding of yourself and your surroundings, and the kind of responsibilities attached to that.
In your speech, when you were talking about the danger of collapse and situational collapse, I'm curious about the danger of like self-collapse and grasping your own mortality, the way that that can either negatively affect the idea of absolute nothingness or becoming aware of absolute nothingness, or it can be used as a resource to get more in tune. Because I think it's a kind of selfish realization that you'll die, or that you're mortal.
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer that. It's very difficult.
If I understand properly, I think the idea is that, I think it goes back to the emotions question. If in the realization and the cultivation of self-awareness, the idea is that you wouldn't be experiencing fear or dread of mortality, but that you'd be experiencing a sense of joy or bliss in the realization. So I would think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that reflection on mortality, and in a sense, your relation to absolute nothingness and mortality, should be freeing, if I'm understanding properly. It should be a sense of not something you should be scared of, but a sense in which you're open to the greater nature of reality, and that you're part of that reality. So rather than seeing death as something that's a kind of finality, that you become part of the greater reality that is. So I don't know if I'm getting that right, but that would be my sense of a response to that. Does that resonate?
One of the things that always strikes me about discussions of this terrain is how much they end up in a sort of negative language, or a language of denial, a talk about what isn't the case rather than what is the case. And you sort of see that in the absolute nothing you're trying to get, and in the Mushin, or maybe the ultimate example, or a very strong example, is the Heart Sutra, which is a list of things that aren't the case or don't happen, or so on. And I think it's one of the things that creates an obstacle that makes most people sort of have trouble with the topic when they encounter it, is you don't normally learn about something by systematic negation, or just by a lot of talk about what it isn't. And the question is that a problem, or is that a feature? Let me not call it a problem. Is that a feature of our language, which is sort of has subject-object built deeply into its conceptual structure? Or is it really something about the nature of this ultimate reality, or a characteristic, a feature of the ultimate reality, that it's so, you know, that it has some sort of non-negative or property?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's definitely part of language that, I mean, the way we conceptualize, the way we express reality is so ingrained with language that, and part of that is, you know, you first posit a subject and then you go on and predicate stuff on it. It's the nature of language to, you want to grab something, right? You want to grasp something and you want to put a label on it. And that's just a very natural way of relating to reality. And that's why I think the Buddhist tradition and Nishida as well, when they resort to these negative terms, is that it's primarily this kind of prohibitive kind of role. It negates. So I like to think of absolute nothingness as a kind of negating activity. It negates our tendency to put labels, to always think in terms of subject-object duality. And of course we want to say, but what is beyond it? What is it really? But that's again just our, you know, it's a kind of language game, and we are so ingrained in thinking in that way that we don't want just this negative activity. We want something. But when we are, I mean, part of realizing absolute nothingness is to let this negating of activity just kind of like go through, be active. Then, you know, it's okay that we posit things. It's not saying that it's not okay. It's okay to posit things. It's okay to understand reality as having meanings. It's okay to partake in this world, but it's not okay to identify ourselves with that. So it's this negating activity that's always going on, and I think it's this process of realizing that we're not this, we're not that. That is part of realizing what absolute nothingness is. It's nothing else than that, I think.
I'd like your comments on some thoughts I had during your talk. It reminded me of a book I read by Viktor Frankl. He was a psychiatrist that spent time in a German concentration camp during the war. The book was called, I think, Mankind's Search for Meaning, and the major question was raised in the book: do not ask for the meaning of life, ask rather what could make your life meaningful. And that reminded me of, it brought up your talk about the mother having her role and making her life meaningful. But then you said there's a deeper meaning going, a deeper reality going into the nothingness. And my thoughts on that, from my learning and my beliefs now, I would rather term that the absolute, the everything, not the nothing, going into the everything, because in the nothingness, as you term it, if you're open to everything in life, and that determines your meaning at that particular moment in life. The mother, the scholar, the brother, the student, the pilot, whatever it is. So in a sense, the nothingness to me is almost everything, and we have everything in us, and we can choose what to bring out in the moment to make our life meaningful.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think you're completely right. I mean, when you are totally emptied out, when you realize that at the deepest level of reality, you're absolutely nothing, like with the example of the haiku, when you're totally emptied out, you're not there anymore. There is reality realizing itself though, right? The reality itself, it's not colored through your lenses, practical concerns anymore, but the reality of the moon and everything surrounding it is realizing itself, it's actualizing itself. And so I think you have to make a distinction between seeing reality as absolutely nothing, that's very nihilistic, and seeing reality through absolute nothingness. Coming to realize that you are fundamentally absolute nothing, which is to say that you are everything. Once you realize that you are emptied out, the content is given from this reality itself. So I think, yeah, that's a very good point.
I just want to thank you for allowing me to grace your presence. I mean, my friend invited me. I didn't know about this, but I follow a teacher. His name is Muji, and I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he's an Ayurveda teacher. Teaches a lot of the teachings from India. Ramana Bhagavate Maharishi was one of the teachings about who am I. So it talks about the I am and how everybody is the I. We start off being born as the I, and then the I is classified through identity of personhood. And through our personhood, we develop through names and forms all type of different qualities of who I am. So then I become, you know, black, I become all of these different traits, but never these things I am not. Because beyond names and forms, I am. So it's kind of interesting, the complexity of it, but yet it's so simple, but yet while I'm in physical form, as a person, I can't identify as the I because I personify the I as being the mind-body, but yet it's beyond the mind-body. So I just wanted to kind of just
thank you. That's very nicely put.
Thank you very much for great talk. But I'm not really sure if it's good idea to talk about something that you don't really experience, like mother's experience. And I am mother, and I'm also a creative person. And actually, when you go through 9 months of creating reality from nothingness or through creative process, you also like create something from nothing, and you have to realize nothingness to create reality. So maybe creative process is something like opposite of awareness of nothingness, or I'm incorrect in this? What do you think about it? What is actually opposite of awareness of nothingness?
Well, I would say the opposite of the awareness of absolute nothingness is the identification of yourself as something. So when you completely, usually we don't do this, we know, we are aware that we can take up different roles, but there's a tendency to identify yourself as something, right? So the opposite would be to identify yourself as something. And I think the creative process, this activity of creating something, creating music, creating poetry, all this is actually a good way to nurture that we are absolutely nothing, that we're not really a thing, but rather a process.